Yeah, this is our 6th Barichara update, which means that we're now getting up to the 1.5-month mark of this process of evolving and clarifying the relationship between the Barichara work and Earth Regenerators, the ER Fund and the Barichara Fund, the various other moving parts, because there's so much involved in this story, including that here locally, we're just beginning to see the shape of how we'll need to clarify the relationship between Territorial Foundation, the Territorial Foundation, Chad's trying to call me for some reason, and Earth Regenerators who come here, and just like, there are like so many parts, and it's sort of an ecosystem soup right now. It is an ecosystem of relationships, but they overlap in so many different semantic domains that that I think it'll just be a clarifying process for a while. I don't know what happened. Chad just tried to call me, and I don't know if he's having some tech problems. Welcome, Lisa, and hello, Irvi. I didn't see hello to you as you arrived. Today, I'm really excited to have Antonio here with us in Barichara, so we can invite him to share in a few minutes about his experience. And I know that Tyler has just booked his flights to come to Barichara, but he has to leave early. So I just wanted to give you the chance, if there's anything you wanted to share, Tyler, before we go into the rest of the flow. No pressure, but if you'd like to, I want to just offer you the opportunity. Is there anything you wanted to say about your plans or intentions for coming here, or do you want to just let it be? I'll pass it to you if you'd like.
Yeah, I don't have a whole lot to say, but just to say that I'm kind of coming down here, hopefully to try to kind of learn more about myself and embed myself into a community. I feel like I haven't had much of an opportunity to do that really in the course of my life too much. So I'm trying to take this as a point for maybe some greater transformation for myself and learn more connected, connectedness to the earth and all that as well, obviously. So I'm very excited, and I'll be looking forward to the experience when I get down there.
Yeah, thank you, Tyler. And for those of you who know or don't know, Lilian, our lovely Lilian here in Earth Regenerators, is arriving tomorrow. She just booked her flights a couple of days ago. This is connected to the work we're doing with Antonio, which I'll invite him to share a bit of his perspective on in a little bit, and connected to the role she's been playing as a sort of juggler and liaison between Earth Regenerators and the Regen Foundation, as we're just exploring these spaces of formal and informal institutions and where all these weird bottlenecks come from. So it's really fascinating to see how broken our institutions are. And even when we have a foundation as innovative as Regen Foundation is trying to be, they're not even able to easily give us the Regen tokens, because they start as a nonprofit and they need to end as a nonprofit, and working across multiple jurisdictions, multiple countries with the initial cohort of community endowments. It's been really thorny and messy, just the learning process of some countries like India have outlawed crypto for nonprofits. And so there's a nonprofit there that was supposed to receive it but can't, and needs to find an external fiscal sponsor. All these really interesting ways that the nation states and their infrastructure are trying to cramp down on and really squeeze and destroy whatever innovation there is within the alternative economic spaces, and using crypto as a bridge place to do that. And so it's really fascinating to see how difficult it's been for Regen Foundation to give us a digital wallet, and just how many ways of clarifying we need to do to get into this space and do something innovative and effective. And so the people at Regen Foundation are wonderful. I love them. They're doing great work, and they just put themselves in a thorny mess, and we're learning a lot. And so if Liliana's here, I'd invite her to share, but she'll be here with us in person tomorrow, so she'll start to join us more. What I'd love to do right now is I have a shorter than normal presentation that might only take 10 minutes or so. I want to just to ground us in a couple of the activities that are emerging, and just some pictures so you can see. I find it really helpful to see visually what we're doing on the ground, and then just have a context of some of the activities. And then from that visual support, it'll help us have the conversation, because so much of what's actually happening here is ephemeral and is in the soft realm of culture. And so I don't have good ways to visualize that. But I think after we just start getting a sense of activities and actions, then we come back to what is the flow and what is the dynamic looking like? Like, what is it like that Antonio just arrived, that Tyler's coming next month, that yesterday Charles and Alpha left, that Lillian's arriving tomorrow? How do these flows of relationships feel, and how complex it all is, and how important that complexity is? And so anyway, we'll come back to that, but what I'd love to do is just give a short presentation that'll help us create a shared context. And then from there, ask Antonio if you'd like to share a bit more about the way that we're thinking about this regenerative finance, regenerative economics event in the first week of October, because it's still taking shape, but it is clarifying. And then from there, we can have just an open discussion about anything that we like. And so, so let me just jump into the presentation so we can move forward into the conversation from there. And so I wanted to start with this picture, because this was just a really, to me, sort of a moment that indicates a lot of things. So see, that's Antonio up in a tree. This is in the food forest in the bioparque. That's Chad standing next to him. They weren't planning for me to take their picture. This is like an incognito shot, and Chad just looked over as I was snapping it. And what I loved about this was, like, for some reason with the perspective, don't they look like little kids? I mean, like, there's something I love about how, for me, I just saw these two little boys playing in a tree. Even though these are two very intelligent, creative grown men. And there was something for me about this that just felt like we can easily forget what it means that we're all just sort of children in this, you know, that we're all just sitting in the unknown on a frontier we've never been beyond before, trying to figure out how to do things that are so complex that the ability to just climb a tree and dangle and remember the lessons that Elise tries to teach me every day really seems very important. And so this was, you know, this was the first or second day when Antonio was here. I went up to the bioparque. He ended up capturing some drone footage a few minutes later, and we pulled some grass. But I just loved this moment, and I wanted to share it with you. What I feel like we're doing right now is we're laying the groundwork for the territorial regeneration. And the laying of the groundwork has been going for years and will continue going for years because this work is so big. But I thought this might be a helpful way of just contextualizing the kind of focus and the kinds of activities that are unfolding this week, which is that we're still spreading the reforestation work. And I'll share a little bit more about what's happening with syntropic agroforestry related to that. And we're also forming alliances. And a lot of these alliances are currently being done online. Antonio and I are playing a really fun Twitter game right now of engaging with various people and pulling them into the conversational flow. And then, as you'll see, we have some older conversations that are maturing to a place of action. And so this forming of alliances, this clarifying of who is allying with whom. Is it Earth Regenerators? Is it the Territorial Foundation? Is it Joe? Is it Margarita? Is it Antonio? Is it Regen Network? Is it bioregional catalysts? It's like, it's really confusing to even know who the alliances are. So as we're doing this, we're actually in some uncharted territory, even with the categories of the actors. And I find that fascinating to explore. And then we're actually incubating some new systems, including some administrative systems, some ways of communicating, ways of organizing ourselves that are coming into being to help us do this work. And we're continuing the birthing of the ecoversity as we go along with this large scale overarching goal of creating a regenerative bioregional economy. But that is so big and so abstract that these smaller, more focused things are sort of like gradually accumulating in that direction. And it's just helpful to keep that bigger picture in mind with this web of existing activities in mind so that we can see how the accumulation of the little pieces relate to the bigger pieces. So, for example, we have some physical activities that also capture some of the strategies and principles we're using. This is something we were doing in the last week, where the syntropic agroforestry system is on the right in each photograph, and on the left is the food forest I was building before. And on the left is a diversity of native bushes and shrubs. On the right is the lines of diverse plants that were planted in the syntropic system. And in between is this one line of invasive grass. And you can see that we started pulling the grass and laying down the mulch the way that we've been doing. And what I want to describe is that we're doing two things. We're opening up a niche that was dominated by the invasive grass, and we're working with edge effects, which is that as we pull this grass, the area where the invasive grass was will now be surrounded on all sides by a diversity of plants with their own seed banks, their own seeds that they will just put out naturally by being living plants. All of the flowering plants on the left, all the others on the right. And so what I wanted to describe here is that a lot of how we're doing the forming of alliances and the envisioning of this regenerative event in October and the ecoversity itself is we're exploring how to open up niches where things were dominated by something unhealthy to give a new space for new life to form. And then how do we try to do that next to or close to potentials for interaction that could generate new effects? And so what you can see here physically with the grass is also what we're doing with our conversations with Regen Foundation and Regen Network and the Cello Foundation and Common Land Foundation and lots of other people, is that by naming this new space of regenerative finance meets on-the-ground land-based projects and placing it between the Cosmoverse event and the Ethereum Bogota event, which is the way that we're thinking of this event for October, it's very similar to we're taking a narrative that clears the grass and we're placing it between two adjacent spaces that are full of potential and diversity and seeing what the cross-pollination looks like. And I wanted this image to help convey how Antonio and Chad and Jacob and Penny and I and the other people were starting to pull into this, like members of the pledge community, how we're using exactly the same strategy that's here with this grass and the structure of the land beside it. That's how we're building the strategy for this regenerative finance event. And so I just wanted you to have a physical metaphor to think with. But I have another physical metaphor to think with. And this is something that Penny thought was so funny, she took a picture of me. We're walking up to the food forest and someone had dropped this big bundle of leaves from their garden that they'd clipped. They'd set them out for the garbage collectors to pick up. And I'm like, wow, let me take those. I can chop them with my machete and make mulch. And then we walk about 100 feet further and I'm like, wow, this branch fell down. This branch would make really good like compost for the trees. It's like a chop and drop. And so next thing you know, I'm like walking, carrying all these branches with this goofy grin because I'm acting like a silly kid collecting toys. And then what I did is just by walking along and noticing things that were useful and picking them up, I knew how to chop those branches and turn them into this naturally decomposing garden bed that I placed around a native Tutumo tree. And here, this is another principle of what we're trying to do in all of our work, is we just look at what's around us that has nutrients to feed our efforts. And then we, with our own hands, pick it up, carry it where it needs to be, lovingly place it in a different form, where the form is more conducive to the life we want to create. And this is like the pledge community that's forming around the ecoversity, starting off with, a Google form and an email list. And then we had our first meeting last week, and now we have a Telegram group. So we're basically picking up the nutrients of these relationships and this energy, and then we're rearranging it into configurations of interaction that can support life. And so I wanted to just show you again, this is a physical metaphor to think about the way that we're gathering people together around regenerative finance and regenerative economics for the work we're doing with ecoversity within the community, and then also the way we're doing the work with social media to connect with people around the world. Now, one thing that's been becoming more clear to us is, since we've already had one syntropic agroforestry workshop, which is placed here at site number 1 in the Bioparque, right above the village of Barichara, and then our second syntropic agroforestry workshop, which is August 3rd through 5th, so just in a little over 2 weeks, is going to be at another site here at site number 2, which is the location of the community huerta, a community garden for people in the rural area known as El Pino. That as we look at these landscapes and think about what does it mean to create a diversity of places on the land, and what does it mean to build webs of relationships to each of them, you can see just in the same way as gathering up those sticks and then placing them around a tree, we gathered the people, the 30 participants of the first workshop, and connected them to the Bioparque at site 1. And now we're preparing with the neighbors who are in this community garden in El Pino. We're gathering them together in the same, that physical metaphor of the sticks around the tree. We're gathering them together in the field site number 2 in the community garden that's in El Pino. And then Syntropy site number 3, which will be in a workshop in September, is going to be in another part of the territory. So I just wanted you to see how these principles of permaculture and of ecological design are the way that we think about the human organization of these activities. And they also are the way that we physically move sticks and grass. And that by practicing both, we're getting better at doing each. Like as we practice both, they each are feeding and informing how the other one works. And I just wanted you to see that a lot of the ecoversity is these subtle ways of learning that are largely invisible. Like you wouldn't know that the way of gathering the sticks and circling them around a tree is the way of hosting a workshop to create a community demonstration site. But that's a really important part of the design approach for the way that the syntropic agroforestry is being done. And I just wanted to name that so that you can see the thought process and see the design thinking that's going to inform how we do a lot of other things, organizing people and projects in the future. And another principle that's really important is not only do we gather sticks and materials, but we learn how to identify the native seeds or just the seeds of the local plants. This is actually moringa from India, so it's not native. So I don't want to call it a native plant. But this is a plant that is a superfood. It's something that can be used for water filtration. There's a project Antonio is involved in using moringa to purify water, to create drinking water that he could talk about if you guys are interested. And these moringa trees are in the cemetery here in the biopark, here in Barichara. And Elise wanted to go to the cemetery. And while we're there, I collected some moringa seeds. And then we walked 10 minutes up to the bioparque, started pulling them out of their pods and planting them all around. And so here the principle is that if you understand the living systems that have their own potentials to grow, that they can grow on their own, the only thing you need to do is lovingly guide them to a place where they can grow. Here, these seeds will just fall on the ground in the cemetery where they routinely cut the grass and clean it, and they'll never grow into trees. But in our food forest, they've got a better chance. So one of the things is to notice a living system dynamic and see the mismatch between where it is and where it needs to be, and then very simply to bring it there and plant it. And this way of thinking, I think, is also guiding a lot of our thinking for the work that we're doing. So I wanted you all to just see the practice and then understand the principle. One thing that we've been seeding and cultivating for a long time is a relationship that I formed back in 2019 when I was one of the guest speakers at the R3.0 conference in Rotterdam, when I met Willem Verweerda, who's the founder and director of Common Land Foundation. Now, what's beautiful about Willem is that he's a conservation biologist. He did his PhD in Colombia in the 80s, created Colombia's first ecotourism company, went on to work with groups like World Wildlife Fund and Conservation International and all of those kinds of NGO players. And then later learned about regenerative economics when none of his conservation efforts really worked. After like 20 years of failure, he really figured out what does work, and then started working on large-scale territorial regeneration. Common Land Foundation, who works with eco-agricultural partners, together I consider them to be one of the best in the world at large-scale landscape regeneration. And I've been talking with Willem for almost 3 years, basically since I arrived in Barichara, that he should come back here because he's actually been to Barichara in the 80s. He hiked through here. And I think the last time he was here was around 1990. And so he and his wife are coming on vacation later this month. And for several months now, we've been talking about having him come for a visit. And so on July 27th, we've blocked out an entire day of activities with him, where we're going to take him to visit some field sites of regenerative projects. And then we're going to organize a 3-hour salon with the people who were part of the Barichara Regeneration Fund as members of the advisory council and the groups of people that are creating the Territorial Foundation, so that we can share knowledge. He can share his knowledge of the 13 countries where they work at scales of 500,000 hectares or larger, and especially focusing on the work in Spain and the Altiplano, which is a 1 million hectare project, because it's the most similar to this landscape and culture. And then also for him to learn about our work, because we see a long-term collaboration with Common Land Foundation as they look for the first territory in Colombia that they might work with and we've been their #1 candidate for 2 years now. But because of the pandemic, he wasn't able to visit. So this means that right now, this week, our local team that organizes the syntropic agroforestry workshops, yesterday we had a brainstorming session and designed a full day of immersive interactive learning with him and with members of the community to really strengthen these relationships and increase the prospects for a long-term collaboration to emerge. And so here you can see all of those design principles of edge effects, of opening niches, of gathering the nutrients that we have and strategically placing them to grow, and of taking seeds of life like the Common Foundation's work and planting it in fertile soil like the community leadership that's happening in the Territorial Foundation. That we're taking all of those principles and applying them to this opportunity with Willem, who has become a dear friend of mine. He's a really lovely person. And I just wanted to share that this way of thinking applies to how we're planning his visit. And when his visit happens, we'll definitely tell you how it goes. And then Antonio arrived. Hi, Antonio. He arrived here 3 days ago with the plan to just be here for about a week so that we could really gestate and birth this idea of the regenerative finance event, which I'll let him share more about, and I'll keep my part of the presentation brief. But I just want to remind us that what we're really trying to do is create a living laboratory of regenerative finance. And so we're not just creating an event. We're weaving together elements that have come before, elements that will converge for a week in October because of 2 big crypto events that are happening before and after the one we're organizing, and then to continue long afterwards if we're able to change the way people think about the conversation. And this living lab of regenerative finance includes the design of the October event, which we can talk about together after the presentation and just share a flow of ideas. It involves the pledge community that's been forming around the Ecoversity, which now has more than 20 members and has just formed a Telegram group. And I know Pamela has been inviting a few more friends to come in, and there may be 1 or 2 people who haven't joined the Telegram group yet. So Pamela, you and I can connect on the side to be sure that gets done. And then we're forming lots of alliances like the one with the Common Land Foundation, but also new kinds of relationships with Regen Foundation, Regen Network, Cello Foundation, EcoStake, and other groups that are playing in this space. The Regenerative Community Land Trust in Colorado and others. There have basically been flows of conversations for more than half a year. And we see this event as being a way of turning those relationships into collaborations. And then of course, the Earth Regenerators who have been here, who are just now leaving, who are just now arriving, and like Tyler, who's going to arrive next month, or Lilian, who's arriving tomorrow, those who are going to come. We also have sort of an expedited process for Benji to come to Barichara, as yesterday he left Maine and began a journey back to Colorado for the sake of healing before he comes to Barichara. There are a lot of these nodes and weaving of connection around Earth Regenerators that are continually present in this. And then of course the Territorial Foundation, which we're now forming a fiscal sponsorship relationship with the national organization Territorial, which is providing support to the Territorial Foundations so that we can clarify the first 6 months of work. They have some money from the Charles Mott Foundation based in Ohio to be, oh no, so I'm sorry, based in Michigan, to be able to bring us some resources and administrative support as we set up the foundation. And they also could be the fiscal sponsor to receive funding on our behalf until the foundation is ready. So next week, we're going to have the conversation and clarify those relationships so that the Territorial Foundation can really come into form in a legal way. Of course, the Barichara Ecoversity keeps taking form. This last week, we had some powerful conversations with our friend Felipe about regenerative education for children and the way that parenting and child raising works, which we'll be able to share more about as it continues taking form. Then the learning centers like Margarita's work with the transformation of local food systems. Just this morning, she sent me this excited message on WhatsApp about how she now understands the next 2 to 3 years of work, how this transformational food center can come into being and create a mercado local, a local market that can actually generate profits for the campesino families. And it's just beautiful how that money that we raised in January through crowdfunding for Margarita, now we're halfway through the time of the funding we have for her, and her work really is birthing a transformational learning center. as well as the Syntropic Agroforestry Learning Center that just continues to evolve and mature as we're expanding and preparing for the next workshop. And the idea for this October event is to take what we've already been learning about the immersive experiences of people who come to Barichara, because we've had Earth Regenerators coming here at different times since January of last year, so a year and a half of this experience, to design an immersive experience for that event that we hope will have a transformational effect in the crypto world. And that means we want to bring not just crypto, but everything from the information communication technology space, everything from Web3 or the next generation of the internet, not only cryptocurrencies, to the land by showing people how we've already been working with EcoStake, with Regen Foundation and Regen Network, with Regen tokens, with the Cello Foundation through the fellowship they've given us, that all of these things are already informing the way work is done on the ground here in Barichara. So we can showcase how crypto can be brought into an anchor to real land-based projects by showing what we're doing here in Barichara at that event. And as we started forming the team to clarify what this event is going to be about, we realized that there are three key elements that for me are exemplified in this image that I have of Chad looking at the Ceiba Barigona, where you can see that here's a focus on authenticity. This is a moment of a real tree at risk of extinction and a real human being having a sacred connection to it. This ability to have both sides be real is something the crypto world has been pretty bad at because they don't know how to connect to reality. And we want to create an event that helps people connect to reality so that from that authenticity and that reality connection, they can seek an integration with good ideas and good digital tools to enable different kinds of governance, different kinds of contracts, different kinds of financial flow, different kinds of data tracking and sovereignty to emerge. And we see a great potential for this and a window of opportunity where the opportunity could be missed. And so that's all I wanted to say in the presentation, because I wanted to give plenty of time for our discussion today. And what I want to invite is instead of letting that presentation be, and now you see all that's going on, it's like, there's so much more going on. And I feel like these weekly updates are kind of overwhelming with how much is going on. And so what I wanted to do is invite a dialogue where Antonio is here and can share more of his experience and some of what we're thinking. Dan, if you would like to share from your perspective of someone who's been connected this for a year in such an interesting and specific way. If anyone has questions or comments, let's just use the rest of our time to have a discussion. And so I don't know what is the best way to move forward from here. If we might ask Antonio if you'd like to share something about the thinking for this event, perhaps that might be the next step. Antonio?
Yeah, I can. The thing that speaks to me right off the bat is the metaphor of physically pulling grass, but I feel like we're mentally having to pull grass from our minds to create space for new ideas and new ways of living. So it's everything is such a mirror, especially here when you're so connected to on the ground living. I think, coming from the US specifically, we're just so used to being locked up in our compartmentalized lives and living our little boxed in separated existences. So when you come to a holistic, fully interconnected community, it's really refreshing. And I think that's what, yes, there is the invitation for the global crypto regenerative finance community to attend ReFi summer camp to reconnect with their inner child and imagination, just as much as it is to bring the outside world here. So one of the things that was really fun that happened this week was there's the weekly English corner or the language exchange. It was it kind of the original plan dissolved in terms of meeting at the place with the people, and for that week it kind of just didn't happen. However, Alpha, Chad and I were walking on our way to dinner, and we bumped into a young woman who works at the local cafe and her mom who were on their way to the English corner, but they it wasn't happening. So they're kind of like standing on the corner waiting around. I'm like, oh, come to dinner with us. But they're like, oh no, I'm with my mom, can't come. So we end up going to dinner. And then an hour later, the young woman and her older brother come, and they end up having dinner and having a wonderful hour-long chat with us. And we got to learn a lot more about, what is it from their perspective growing up as a young person here in Barichara, learning that the wage at the local cafe is 5,000 Colombian pesos, which is about $1.25. So it's, there's not much opportunity there. But to think about, what does regenerative finance mean to give young people a livelihood? So that really inspired me and gave me a lot more kind of expanded view of, what this event could be. So just, every day there's little moments of light bulbs going off. And so I'm just grateful for that. And also just regarding this ReFi event, it's almost like the unevent. It's like the event's doing itself, because that's the whole point, is to see what emerges from this this kind of synchronicity of happenings. So I don't know what else. Well, actually, no, there's one other thing I wanted to share, just to give everybody an idea of what's happening in the ReFi space, because even for people in crypto, ReFi is even like, they don't even understand what it is, let alone the people who are in the ReFi space trying to define what it can be.
Yeah, it's so confusing.
Yes, but I think the important thing to realize here is that the traditional financial system is collapsing right before our eyes. So understanding how do we finance regeneration with both these new tools, but also with this new cultural awareness and understanding is a massive opportunity. And I know we've been focusing a lot on Barichara and on the ReFi industry, but this is something that everybody around the world will eventually have to understand and participate in. So I think this is an event for the Earth Regenerator global community as much as it is for the ReFi space as well. So I want to extend the invitation to all Earth Regenerators to come to Barichara the first week of October, if that's possible, to participate in these emergent workshops, activities, salons. You walk around town, you go, and we went to Bianca's house, who's a local apicultora, selling honey. And you realize that there's just not enough peso liquidity running around town. So everybody, how can you exchange if you don't have anything to exchange with? And this is what led to a conversation with Margarita yesterday, describing how she is developing her own local currency based off of granola. So the short story is, she has this kitchen, she has a farmer friend, he brings her pineapples. Now, traditionally it'd say, well, I'm going to sell my pineapples to you for pesos, versus what she's made is an arrangement to say, let's make a credit so that I'm going to take these pineapples. I have a humidifier. We're going to turn these into pineapple chips. And she gives the pineapple farmer an option of either accepting payment in pesos or accepting payment in the pineapple chips, or doing some other arrangement with a tienda reseller where they're selling the pineapple chips for pesos. So there's this huge emergence of trust networks that is the core of the regenerative finance space. And I think that's it's a counterintuitive thing, because crypto economics is based off of how do you have trustless transactions with people online who you may or may not know have the best intentions. So we're taking this trustless system that creates trust, because if you trust the blockchain to execute a transaction based off of software code that can't be corrupted, combine that with on the ground neighbor to neighbor trust. So the more that they trade their pineapples and their services, the more trust gets built up. This is really beautiful. So I'm really excited to see what else emerges from this convergence. And I was just on the call with whoa, that's a big cockroach. I was just on the call with
They can be like this long, and they're biodiversity, baby.
I was just on the call with the Regen Network Foundation. Regen okay, so maybe this is just to point out. So Regen Network is the company that maintains the code base for that software platform blockchain. Regen Foundation is a separate entity, although they are side by side. Regen Foundation is responsible for the internal currency for the Regen network, which is called Regen. So the Regen token is the internal currency that manages the blockchain. And what I mean by that is if you want to do a transaction on Regen network, let's say you want to issue an eco credit, you want to redeem carbon credits, you want to interact with the ledger, you will have to pay Regen to process that transaction on the blockchain. So that's kind of a general idea of what is crypto economics, because if you're running a blockchain, you need to have an internal currency that regulates the supply and demand of that limited block space. Versus Facebook, I'm going to create a fake account. I'm going to spam. It doesn't cost me anything to create all these fake accounts, right? So that's the difference between Web 2, which is ad-based, subscriber-based kind of, let's take all the user data and resell it to third parties, versus Web 3, where each blockchain is its own sovereign economy and it has an internal token. So if we were to say, well, what if the bioregional economy had its own blockchain and its own internal currency to be managing these transactions versus a peso, petrodollar extractive currency? So these are a lot of the nuances in regenerative finance, regenerative crypto economics. And ideally, we get to a point where our economic systems, which is basically our cultural systems, is reflective and in harmony with our ecological systems. So this is the conversation that's being had. I wanted to share just a little image to give you a better scope of how fast the ReFi space is growing. So is there a way I can share?
Yeah, I'm going to make you a co-host right now.
Okay. And what I'm about to share, this is in no way, shape, or form the entire landscape of regenerative finance projects. So how it's happening is there are multiple platforms, we can call them blockchains, that are vying to be the home for these regenerative projects. So Celo is one, Regen Network is one, even Ethereum, people are trying to do impact organizations. Okay, let's see. Share screen. Whiteboard, desktop. Oh, here we are.
Yeah, and then I see Midi has her hand up, so maybe after this we can go to her.
So this is just a very, very simple version of, can we see that? Is that?
Yeah.
Yes, yes.
Okay, great. So this is from, I think, last March. So imagine from March to now, this has probably tripled in size in terms of the amount of projects, people that are saying, hey, I have an idea for a token for planting trees. I have an idea for like beach cleanups using NFTs. I have an idea for like co-housing in eco villages. So, or carbon credits, eco credits. So this space is rapidly evolving. But once again, you know, we don't know if this is invasive grass or not. Like, so even though there is a proliferation of these ideas and projects, they are not coherent. They are not connected in base principles, base assumptions. How do we know that what's in our head is actually what's happening on the ground outside? So I think this is another driver for the need to bring people together in person on the ground to actually become more coherent so that we can be more effective as a community and as an industry as this ReFi space continues to grow before it gets captured by Silicon Valley, techno utopias that will eventually become top-down dictators in whatever weird system evolves from the disconnected lifestyle. So that's pretty much what I have. Happy to answer any questions or pass the mic on.
Thank you, Antonio, and on to you, Midi.
Thank you so much, Antonio. It's wonderful to see you in Barichara. And it's really clear that I've got a lot to learn and be stimulated by in listening to you. I want to pick up several strands from this conversation. The first is, I remember in one of Joe's chapters, he speaks about the conference where everybody gets together and how different it is from regeneration. There's a tension in me. The tension is that I have many, we're reading together Hosting Modernity in our book club in ER. And I have so many people on my bus. The Midi bus has all these people, and they're at the moment, they're speaking so loudly to each other that none can hear the other. So I've got one person saying, how useful is it for Midi to get on an aeroplane to go to Barichara when actually she could stay here and hear what goes on in Barichara and not be increasing her footprint through a plane ride when her own economy is collapsing anyway, because she has her currency in a country where she earned money and it's crashing against the US dollar where she actually lives. So that's one little bit that is kind of bubbling in me. And I see that Gail put a question in the chat saying, will any of the Barichara ReFi conference be online? I would make a plea now that it could be for those of us that maybe can't be there in October. The second thing is that I want to speak to the invasive grass. I loved you saying that, Antonio. I want to know, how do we test for those Indian seeds? How do we, at the same time as noticing the places for the Indian seeds to grow, do we yet know enough about the effect that the Indian seeds can have upon the native ecology? Because I live in a state which is actually very conscious, and a part of the state which is deeply conscious about the effect of invasive grass. Because all those ranchers of the 19th century thought they were doing the best they could when they planted grass that their animals could eat. And we're bearing the effects of that today ecologically. So that's another set of questions. The third set of questions is around my beloved community in Barichara. And I'm remembering, I think it was last week, Joe speaking to the kind of reflections that you're currently having around how to welcome the newcomers, how to relate, da-da-dee-da-dee-da. I have a question which is, how are you long-term residents taking care of your energy boundaries? Because I've lived this kind of experience where you have people who come on holiday and they want to see Joe and Penny and Kathy and interact. And then I have people who wanted to come for 2 or 3 months, and they too at the start, it's Joe they've got to see, Antonio probably now because he's Mr. Finance. And how do you manage the space so that Joe and Penny and Kathy have time to breathe, have their own time, have their refueling time? And it's just a question, because it's at one level, it's none of my business, but at another level, it's everything to do with my business, because I need Joe and Penny and all the others who are long-term residents to be really healthy and well in their own energetic space. So those are the 3 sets of things that have come up for me, and I actually also see them weaving together. Thank you.
Yeah, I can respond to these just to give a shape to the conversation, which is, one, the idea of an online event is we're having an online event right now, so that wouldn't really be very different. And I say that only because there are moments for different kinds of action. And the moment for this event really grew around the Cosmoverse Medellin event and the ETH Bogota event, which gets a bit at your very thoughtful comment about getting on an airplane when your own economy is collapsing, which is that a lot of people are already coming to Colombia. And we may have the opportunity to engage with those people, give them a different kind of experience by passing from Medellin to Barichara to Bogota. And there's already a serious need at these multi-thousand person events for a decompression. Because, I mean, I think we've all been in those conference halls with several thousand people and all the talks, and just like, it is absolutely destructive to the human well-being to be in those contexts. And so there's something about just sort of holding space for this opportunity as an edge effect. And so it's helpful to think of this event in that context rather than for its own strategic framing without that context, because that does change how it's thought about. And the third topic, the topic of how do people from the outside relate to here, one thing I'm seeing is that by having things go well, go sideways, go badly, go all kinds of ways, is how we actually are figuring it out. And now we couldn't figure it out with a whiteboard and diagrams on a piece of paper. And I think that's a really interesting thing. Like yesterday, I was talking with Natalia Ortiz, who's one of the lead people in the Territorial Foundation. And she had observed that all the earth regenerators who came here in the last 2 months were sort of their own cultural bubble. And they didn't really have a good way to integrate with the community. And she saw that in a variety of ways and was just asking me, what is the relationship that I see for earth regenerators in the Territorial Foundation? So we could begin to clarify that and say, how does that work? Because someone who comes for the short term just won't integrate into the community, which is it's a long, slow process to integrate into the community. And so just holding that kind of an awareness that different people show up in different ways for different timeframes, and they do create sort of cultural bubbles or cultural membranes or just different fragmented cultural domains, fragmented because of their inability to fully integrate, or even that it may not be desirable for them to. And so I see this, at least initially, as while the flow is low, we can experiment and learn. And then we can decide if it will ever be high. And I suspect that global supply chains and the financial system will collapse before it can ever become high. I suspect that the fear of huge numbers of people coming to Barichara, especially over longer amounts of time, is unlikely to have tenable assumptions simply from the collapse patterns that are occurring. Now, that doesn't mean that we ignore those risks. We hold them, we just include that in the thinking about holding them. You see how that's like a beginning of a long, slow, gentle conversation on many fronts. It's really delicate how all of this works. So just having sensitivity to it, as your question is so beautifully sensitive, I think that sensitivity is essential to just keep having it without having any real answers at this point. You know, growing clarity for this part or that part, but it's a long road. Claire, you've been patiently waiting. I'd love to hear from you.
Oh, that's great. I know I've got to leave at 10 as well. And I'm feeling like I really want to just make an observation, because there's a whole bunch of pieces that feel like they're kind of starting to gel in a way that I have not been able to see them before. And I just want to say the most incredible gratitude for, you you sometimes talk about, I think it's jiu-jitsu or
Aikido,
yeah,
or whatever, yeah.
Aikido, yeah. And just how I realized that's how it's so difficult to be able to represent that to anyone when you're, say, looking for funding, because what are you representing? And it's just, there's not a good way of translating those two. And Benji had been proposing some time back something, the Bioregional Weavers Guild. And for the first time, I started to kind of like really get what that might look like, where if there's a group of people that are doing this work, and there's all the messiness of the goals of what you're sort of trying to do in terms of the big patterns, the relationships you're trying to form, but then the messiness of everyone's lives, because they're the people doing the work, but bringing that all in, but having a safe space to be able to process that, kind of keep on track. There's a wisdom that comes from being collectively in that space, and then figuring out how to communicate that out so that so this was so this was the other piece that really just was that big aha for me, Joe, was you, about 6 months ago, you talked about how the Earth Regenerators Fund could maybe start, that we weren't a funding organization, but that we would look at people's proposals and then look at the needs and see how we can support them. And so when you flip it like that, was such an important flip for me, because you then get away from the finance and you start looking at how are we effective and what are the pieces that we need. So all I wanted to say is, I'm not saying anything that's new. It's just that there's a whole bunch of pieces that are just starting to kind of click into place that are way too hard to see when we're trying to think through it on our own or sometimes in conversation. But just this very open sharing of the Aikido moves are just really helping. And I just want to acknowledge that, because it is feeling like I'm starting to see more clearly how we could start to do this. So yeah, thank you.
Well, Claire, I think when we start learning from what you're doing in the same process, you know, the way that you've done the community art projects for so long, but now you're bringing the bioregional weaving as an explicit body of work. And I was already thinking, so just as an example, I spoke a few days ago with Jonathan Kabat. I don't know how many of you know who he is. He has the Hotlem EcoRestoration Camp just outside of Mount Shasta in upstate California. And it was the example, for those of you who've seen my webinars about it, it was the ecosystem restoration camp that burned to the ground in a wildfire last year. And Jonathan is so good at that jujitsu that he actually got John Liu to come and work with him, because he and Della Duncan and a handful of other people are working on the Klamath River Basin and a network of other rivers in Northern California to do watershed restoration as the ecology and the economy are collapsing. And so we had a call the other day and he said, Joe, we're trying to do this. Could you be an advisor? And I was like, I'm unreliable because I'm so busy and I don't know how busy I'm going to be at any time. Me as an advisor is a bottleneck. I'll just frustrate you, especially if I want to do it. I'll be frustrating to me too. But what it sounds like you need is you need a bioregional weavers guild for this project on Earth Regenerators. Let me contact some of my ER friends in California. So I immediately sent a message to Midi. Duh, that was a no-brainer. Midi, you're already thinking about this. I'll talk to Alpha too. Let's get a conversation started. And the idea was that what he's doing in Northern California is taking an ecological, economic cascade of collapse and trying to hold dialogue around how to turn it around with the community. And I was like, oh, wait, if they're organizing this event, we want ER members, Stan, there's already a group organizing in Portland, Oregon that could come down in like 5 hours of driving and spend the weekend doing an ecosystem restoration camp if there was a group on ER promoting it. So it's not just the California people, but the Oregon people. And I could just see how, because we're already forming these bioregional nodes and we don't quite know how to activate ourselves, like what does the Portland group to do to activate itself? Not really sure, but holy shit, Jonathan's been creating it in Northern California. Go and practice with him. Create a design group to support him and then learn from it and then bring it right back to your own territory. And so this way of creating these bioregional learning clusters, whatever forms they take, like that's the real benefit of all of this. And so Barichara has been the most visible example up till now. But if there's a group actively researching the Klamath River with Jonathan and John Liu and the group there in Northern California, very quickly, because they're already doing it, they're just not doing it in ER, that it would become very visible, just like Osa Peninsula became visible through the project incubator, bioregional catalyst, and the relationship to the ER fund. It became visible to ER. So what other spaces are there that are not yet visible that will start to become visible through these relationships? And that's what I think is the real power of ER in the long run. To take the kinds of things Antonio was talking about, saying there are these infrastructure pieces for communication and coordination and measuring value, but they're not on the ground. But if we organize around things on the ground, it's totally different. So just naming that a lot of this will become more clear in the next year as we just stay in the messiness and keep going. So Irvi, I see you've just raised your hand. Perfect timing.
Thank you. And yeah, I just want to add my thanks for having these sessions. I find them so incredibly helpful and a really, really valuable learning opportunity. So thank you. I wanted to ask a question to Joe or Antonio or anyone else who feels like chiming in about this thing that was mentioned earlier on about building alliances, something like that. And I'd love to hear more about your process of discerning where within this complex ReFi space you feel like, you know, there's most potential for building those useful alliances and where's the noise, and that there's some real discernment, kind of sounds like there's some real wise discernment going on around where you want to focus your efforts and how, and yeah, we'd just love to hear a bit more about that.
I would actually love to use my relationship with Antonio as an example. Antonio, is that okay with you?
Senor.
Because so for those of you who don't remember the history, we started talking about buying the land Las Albercas like 2 years ago. The money manifested in some form in like October, November last year. And then December, for various reasons, I started putting out into the world, I am ready to accept crypto for the work that we're doing. I'm ready to enter into the crypto space. And immediately 2 things happened. That was partly because some of the money for Las Albercas may have come from Ethereum. And I was like, oh, well, we're already sort of doing it. Well, we can tell the story about it now. And so when I put that announcement out, which was like on Twitter, I'm ready to talk to crypto people. One thing that happened was Gregory Landaway wanted to give me regen tokens because he and I are friends. And he'd already given me money. Like he gave money to buy Oriental Agua. For those who don't know, Gregory is founder and the director of Regen Network. So he and I had podcast interviews, and we weren't good friends, but we sort of knew each other and mutual admiration. And he gave me $1,000 toward Oriental Agua. But when I said, oh, I'm setting up a crypto wallet, but I don't know how to do that, Antonio reaches out to me and says, hey, I can help you set up a crypto wallet. And Antonio and I have a conversation, and he shows me how to use Kepler and how to use Cosmos, tells me what staking is, tells me what liquidity pools are, gives me just little bits of money in my crypto wallet to just do that. It's like, here, let me give you some, I'll give you an atom, I'll turn a little bit of it into an Osmo, turn a little bit of that Osmo into regen tokens, and this is how you do staking. And he's just like, you know, a little like hour-and-a-half tutorial. And once I had that, I was like, oh, in my Kepler wallet, I have a regen address for regen tokens. Hey, Gregory, you want to give me regen tokens? And he did. And that's when Gregory knew to send the Regen Foundation to us to bring those 500,000 Regen tokens to ER. And so you can see that the alliance forming was around. Antonio could tell you his own story of how he had been watching me and knew that I'd be someone who would be worth helping set up a crypto wallet. But Gregory was waiting until Antonio helped me set one up. And then after that, Austin from Regen Foundation is like, so Gregory told me to talk to you. I need to give you some regen tokens. I didn't know yet it's going to be 500,000 regen tokens. And you see, we started learning together. And the way that the strategic alliances happened was we would have these bullshit sniffer conversations. We would just talk to each other and be like, we don't have to ideologically align on everything. Antonio and I are not aligned on everything. But we can see that we are aligned on pragmatism, action, and systemically seeing the space. And because that action piece was so key, when I said, can someone help me set up a crypto wallet? And Antonio's like, got you, man, let's do it right now. Action, it was action. And then later, EcoStake approaches me and says, we need to give 1/3 of our staking returns to someone who does on-the-ground projects. I was heard you have good projects. Okay, someone told them that. It was Antonio. And so why? Because they trusted Antonio when he said I was doing good stuff on the ground. And so you see there's this trust transferred between people who are trying to get things done with enough shared understanding of the world that we can collaborate around action. And that has been so essential. That orientation of being flexible with ideology and being pragmatic with action and being complex in our thinking. And it's really interesting how that accumulates. Same thing with Willem Verwerda, just watching and said, I don't know how you're cultivating all that governance on the ground and community buy-in and engagement, but that's exactly what common land can't do. And that's why we're not able to replicate our work. And so I talked to them 2 years ago about receiving money from their accelerator lab to create regenerative leadership and bioregional governance so that common land could just come in and bring resources without having to facilitate it themselves. And that's why right now is the perfect time for Willem Verweerde to arrive. And he's already connected me with $100 million funds from the Landscape Finance Lab who cannot bring money to the ground because there's not coordinated action to implement at that scale. And so it's simply by seeing each other as 5 years from now, we'll collaborate because you're building the on-the-ground capacity. I'm building the United Nations network of capacity. They do not touch right now, not even close. But if we're looking forward, we're allies in this. And so that maybe just gives a flavor of it. But I don't know, Antonio, if you want to add to that. Or if anyone else wants to add to that, we can open it up.
Yeah, I just wanted to say, how do we, and this has been a question that's come up as well in the conversations about organizing this event, how to, people self-select, I think. No, if somebody came here and they had, you know, bad intentions, it would become very apparent and it would just like, just get, the immune system would just kind of flush them out. And I think right now it's more of a call and attraction to who really wants to be here. And going back to Midi's question of, is it worth me coming here? I would say absolutely. The spiritual awakening from being in this place is priceless and more valuable than any plane flight would ever cost. And of course, you know, do we want to talk about carbon offsets for travel? And this is more about regenerating the spirit as much as it is about regenerating finance. So for people who are wanting to come for a deep cathartic experience, for people coming here for the ReFi thing, I mean, it's not like, oh, hey, come here for a week and we're going to figure out all the problems. It's more about, we're going to come here and we're going to actually trust each other that we can work together to figure out the problems as they come and keep on coming. So I think that's more of the intention for this event. And hopefully, and I have hope that by doing this acupuncture event in real life, we're going to be able to do the fundraising for the Ecoversity with the tools to help scale it up to the level that needs to be done on the regional scale. That makes sense.
Could you say a bit more about the last part?
Yes. So let's say, well, we need to raise money for an Ecoversity. But what we're really saying is we need to create a model for raising money for ecoversities in multiple places. So by developing the model here, we're going to be able to create that scaffolding infrastructure to say, well, we need to do $1 million or the equivalent in currency to acquire more land, to activate more people, to create more economic systems. So the Ecoversity is not the end goal, it's actually just the beginning. And this goes into more of the work that I've been writing and researching about how to take the permaculture regenerative economics frameworks that have existed for almost 40 years. And we're talking about land trusts, credit unions, worker cooperatives, community currencies, all these things. These are not new ideas. What is new is that we actually have scalable technology to implement those tools. Because if we've had the permaculture designer's manual out since the 1980s, and you go through the last chapter, you can read everything you want to know about how to set up land trusts, how to set up these worker cooperatives, eco villages, the full stack regenerative culture expansion pack, but we haven't had the tools to do it. So I was talking with Joe about this earlier. A good metaphor to think about is the printing press, where before the printing press, it was really expensive to manufacture books. Like somebody had to sit down and write it. So you had these monks who were just writing these books in these the monasteries, and the priest, who was the only one who could read Latin, would be the one who was interpreting the Bible into what the peasants could understand. Now, when the printing press was invented, now you can print Bibles at scale. Now everybody has a chance to interpret it the way they want to, but that creates all sorts of discoherence around what is the true word of God. And then you have, you know, the Protestant Reformation, all sorts of violence erupt in Europe. And not only that, but you have people printing their own pamphlets saying all sorts of things. Now, do we blame the printing press, or is it more of the human cultural lack of ability to manage that technology because we were too immature? So this is a good example where with blockchain technology, as the evolution of the internet continues, we're getting the power of a central bank, we're getting the power of a Supreme Court, we're getting the power of a large multinational corporation into something that is near zero marginal cost. So yeah, we can say, well, these people who are selling these stupid JPEGs for millions of dollars, like, you know, shame on them. But really, we just need to get better at using the tools. We need to have better problems to solve. So I think that's the shift in understanding as we go into this fundraising mode, because the dollars will never get us to where we want to go. The euros won't get us to where we want to go. The dollars are the fertilizer to decompose into the regenerative economic systems as we take the land out of the speculative market back into commons trust, which is the foundation for the large-scale territorial regeneration that will give the stable foundation for those local economies.
Can I get an amen? And then Pamela.
Thank you, Antonio.
Okay. All of that, interesting. No comment at this point over my head. Aside from that, lots of questions. The one thing though that I am wondering if someone could speak to is the impact of travelers in Barichara. That's been in a couple of postings, and it's just raised an intriguing question about how well can that community, what is happening with Barichara, how is this impacting? And okay, Joe, you get what I'm saying. So yeah, I really would like to hear this.
Yeah, I mean, one thing is that every tourist moment throughout the year, Barichara goes from 6,000 people to 20,000 people on the weekend. And they handle 15,000 tourists at a time. And that's about half of the year. You know, at different moments. Like between mid-December and mid-January, during Holy Week, we just had 3 weekends in a row of San Pedro, the St. Peter's holidays that are really big, but thousands and thousands of people here every weekend. And so for one thing, it is very arrogant of us to think that we are as big as the tourism flows in Colombia. When we have like 5 people come, or we have 100 people come, or even 1,000 people come, is minuscule compared to the tourism flow that's already happening. And that's just a thing to name. That's part of the backdrop of the current context. Another thing is when I saw those comments being made and those articles being posted, I was curious why none of them who are Earth regenerators wanted to talk to me about the local culture before having their reflections. Because it was interesting to see some really basic misunderstandings, just because like Taylor wrote a post where he had been here for like a week and a half. And he was speaking earnestly from his experience, but not really having a good understanding of what the cultural context is yet. I've been here nearly 3 years and I'm getting pretty good. And I have a ton to learn. There's so much I don't know yet. And so there's something really important about really honoring the complexity of learning culture and how central it is to all of this work. It's so central to all of this work. And like one thing that I see is at the core of Margarita's work, and if you were to come here in person and talk to her, she just says it over and over again, that all of her work is dealing with cultural trauma, dealing with the poverty mindset of campesinos who have internalized colonizer ideas. And that the long-term immune system of any place is for local people to value their own heritage and their own land. And so there's a whole realm of how best to do that, and how much the globalized economy and market dynamics are basically designed to destroy local culture everywhere on Earth. And then there's another thing, which is just like a context factor to hold and think about, which is the biggest threat to the culture here is that there are more than 20 million people in Bogota, and more than half of them live in slums and are already displaced. And if there are major shocks to the global supply chains or financial systems, all the violence that breaks out as those people spread out into the landscape will come here. And there are more than 1 million people in Bucaramanga, which is only 16 miles away as the crow flies, 3 to 4 hours by car because of the curves of the mountains. And so the bigger threats to the culture here are collapses of the cities, even more so than the tourism, even though the tourism is already having a very big effect and it's effectively unstoppable at the moment. The only thing that has stopped it is the pandemic, basically disruptions to global supply chains. And so the only way to stop it from happening right now is to collapse the global economy. And so it's just interesting to hold that awareness of just how complex this is. Because notice that I'm not saying that as a bypassing move. I'm just saying it as everywhere on earth has to deal with this, including Barichara. And no one is safe from it because we're about 7 billion humans beyond the carrying capacity of the earth. And so it's just, I come back to this because it tells me that I'm not trying to stop that flow of things into Barichara because I can't stop it. I can't stop whatever's coming from Bogota. Instead, it's how to create enough genuine sovereignty and regenerative culture in the local place that it has a chance of surviving those things, that it just has a chance of surviving them. Because human extinction is a real possibility, and collapse and destruction of ecosystems all over the planet as cities empty out in different places at different times, or maybe a lot of them all at once, is just, I'm very aware that that is our future, that that's what we're preparing for as we're doing this work. And so for me, without understanding planetary collapse and really coming to a place of acceptance with it, I don't think I could even attempt viable strategies for this kind of work. Just attempt them. I'm not certain that any of this is going to work. It's just that I'm embedded in a culture and a community that has invited me in a way that I can do this work here. And so I do this work here. And this is so important to just be sober about how complex these challenges really are. As the one thing that's been interesting is that Barichara has become greener in the last 30 years than it was before because the monoculture cropping of tobacco was so severe. But the regreening was people planting trees with invasive grass below, which actually perpetuated biodiversity loss because of that confusion about trees not being forests. And so this work of creating food forests, and what we're doing is syntropic agroforestry, which is let's look at compositions of either native plants or plants that function in ecosystems like this one, that grow in a way that can create an alternative forest economy. And that forest economy will not need money from the outside after a certain point of its growth if there's some local way of tracking its change. And so that way of thinking is really the key here, is to what extent can we put more and more energy into building these trust-based economic exchanges built together with biodiversity that is as robust as possible as it can be within these climatic and ecological changes that just might survive the flow of people and violence when cities collapse. And Barichara has got a real strength in being in a network of mountains and canyons that are largely impenetrable without fossil fuel transport. And so it's got a chance of surviving if those collapse patterns happen in just the quote right ways. And so this is just to name how difficult this is. Because I think there's something really important about how each of us finds our own way to wherever we belong in this work on the planet. And that people coming here to observe and see it and to have some experience that they take to somewhere else is, in a way, that's a much better kind of tourism than what's happening now. And it's just a little drip in the flow of tourism that's already happening, because Barichara is a major tourist destination for Colombians. San Gil, a little further away, 25 kilometers away, is a global destination of extreme sports. People from Europe go there in much larger numbers to do whitewater rafting, bungee jumping, bouldering, all those things. And that doesn't happen in Barichara. But Barichara is a place for local arts and crafts, a place to rest, a place that's beautiful. And so it's where rich Colombians come to. And it's not very well known to outsiders. And so there's actually a battle over the narrative and identity of this place that's happening with tourism, which happens where any place where there's tourism. So to the extent that we can cultivate regenerative mindsets here and build a sense of pride with local people here about why they are regenerative and what's beautiful about the campesino culture, the better they themselves will buffer against the land grabs, prostituting their land to foreigners, thinking that money's worth more, and all these other things that are happening. And so that's where I see like the $20,000 that came in a gift to create the Syntropic Agroforestry Center, and now doing the syntropic agroforestry work to cultivate these forest economy models as much as possible with local campesino people, because we don't need to cover the cost of the workshops. Like one thing I could share about the workshop that's happening in the first week of August is it's embedded within a garden that was born from the pandemic. The tourism economy collapsed and the people of Guane, that's a little village in the countryside, or some of the poorest people in the territory, because of two amazing women, Natalia and Yvonne, who are amazing organizers. They gathered the local people, 16 families, to create a subsistence food system to survive the collapse of tourism. That's the community huerta where the workshop is going to be in first week of August. And the strategy is try and get young people from that rural area to take the workshop and cultivate them as leaders. And they don't have to pay, we will actually pay them. We will pay them campesino wage labor, the labor you pay them to come work on your farm to plant trees. We're going to pay them that to attend the workshop, because we raised the money from the outside to cover the cost of the workshop and to pay for the teacher. And so this way of turning the money signals around, we're composting US dollars into local capacity for food cultivation with local leadership for managing it within a community infrastructure of subsistence agriculture. It's that way of thinking that is, well, wouldn't we like more people thinking that way coming here than less within this tsunami of tourism that's already happening? So again, it's just contextual. See, it also, that doesn't answer the question, but it just shows the context, right? It's, the context is so much more complex than being afraid that someone who comes here and says, I might like to live here, so I could be the one that my own personal guilt is what we need to deal with. You know, my personal guilt says we all could be a problem. It's like, well, we actually have to learn this web of interconnected patterns. And then from that awareness, cultivate a nuanced capacity for wisdom over time. Was there something you want to say back to that, Pamela, before we go to Jan, or is that?
Yeah, there is actually, Joe. I really appreciate that. And the context is what I feel is really enriching at this moment, but I think also really enriching for understanding the complexity of the environment that it is that people are going to. And I think some people have been surprised, because that isn't something that's being built into the Earth Regenerators part of the story of Barichara, because all of the focus is primarily on just what is happening within the Territorial Foundation, the parks and all of this. So I think having this now raised as one of the larger contexts would lower the temperature for how people respond to their experience of being part of the tourist flow in Barichara. So thank you very much for sharing that. And if I may be so bold as to say that maybe sprinkling that in every now and again where it is relevant, so that when people arrive, there is that sense of the context of the arriver, the context of the visitor, and lessening that sort of, oh, is this going to harm? Thank you very much, Joe. I really appreciate that.
just before going to Jan, just to say that we're now in something like the third wave, or actually this week starting the fourth wave of Earth Regenerators coming to Barichara. And what's turned out to be really powerful is other people telling their stories here and how differently that affects people than when I tell stories. And how important it is that they tell those stories. Like when Rachel was giving her, her iPhone walks, giving little videos, how important it was to have her perspective. Because how different it was from just the way I told the story. Even when we told the same thing, she told it differently. And so that diversity of perspectives is extremely valuable, extremely valuable. And you can see how much it's generating this entrance into the more complex dialogue. So I just think that's really, really important. And now, Jan, thank you for your patience. On to you.
Well, in some ways, I think the last exchange with Pam, and you kind of named the piece I was feeling too. It's like how to keep, if this is a Barichara update, how do we get a larger sense of the Barichara, the various people there? Because it's kind of, it ends up sliding into being a Joe update, even though other people at times are here and invited, but, or you've tried to get other people. It's like, how do we get that larger sense of the context you just named, and weave that into the larger Earth Regenerators somehow. And I also feel the same sense around you naming when Irvi asked you about, the alliances and the relationships and how to work with those. It's like those also seem to focus around connections with you, Joe, a lot. And so, which I'm sure is just one of the dynamics in this complexity. And then how does that, so one of the learnings for all of us in this, because I think this is a pattern that is not just unique to this group, but it's anytime a new initiative and great ideas and things are happening, how do we keep the larger engagement and communication and distribute the leadership so that, so we don't get into this knot that can happen, and then we get then we get a reaction to the knot, and then it's like, but how do we all own this and name it and share the complexities of a very complex and layered contextual situation, and to do it at a distance and online. So just kind of naming that, because I think it's a little bit of the edge of what Pam was meaning too.
Thank you for that, because I think what you're getting at, or one thing you're getting at, is how can we function as superorganisms? Like how can we function as these larger intelligences? These ways of holding the complexity together rather than holding parts of the complexity separate. And one of the things that I think is really powerful about the way we're attempting this is that from the beginning, back with Origen del Agua, because of the way crowdfunding played into it, there were already a few hundred people connected to that project in one way or another, about 150 people who contributed money to Origen del Agua. And so it created a feeling of something that was distributed even by people who had never been here, because they'd never been here. And then some of them, when they came here, wanted to go and visit that land and connect to it and already felt part of the story. Dan, I know that was part of your experience. And then that continued to augment their relationship to this complex thing. And as we just learn new ways to hold this complexity, I think this current round of these Barichara updates is another exploration of that. Like we also have the ER podcasts that are starting to roll out, and that's going to be really helpful. Different people interviewing each other and sharing their stories. I think that's going to be really helpful to figure out this peer-to-peer communication and some focused coordinated communication. And then also there's another piece that's the other direction, which is the Territorial Foundation, as it's forming, is going to form a wisdom council of only local people in Barichara, and they will become gatekeepers to what is allowed in and what's allowed out as the sovereignty of their own bioregion. And that's going to be really important to figure out, well, what does that say about communication when that sovereignty is so important? And so, we're going to end up with a lot of thorny issues as we stumble into like briar patches that we didn't even know were there yet, and then navigate our ways through them. That I can already sense that this learning process, and just again, holding that messiness as well as we can, is going to be so valuable for us to learn between bioregions. Because that sovereignty of place and that territorial governance is going to become really important in each place. And I can already see some of that rub, like we're almost to those rubs. They haven't even happened yet. Territorial foundation doesn't quite exist yet. But when it does, and it has its own wisdom council, it has its own thematic focus areas, and then people from the outside come and want to learn about it and want to participate in it, those rubs will be there. And we're going to need to learn how to navigate them. So it's that kind of learning that I think Antonio is getting at. How do we learn how to set up these ecoversities? How do we replicate them from place to place? We can't shy away from talking about these messy things. We have to find helpful, supportive, diplomatic ways and effective ways to communicate about them. And we're going to stumble a lot because we don't know how to do that. Like, we know parts of it, but we've never done this part before. And I'm really, in a way, I'm enlivened by that. Because I've been holding the messiness myself and watching people confused around me as I was doing things I didn't understand. And I'm like, what kind of support do I need personally to do this? And what do we all need to do this? And I think that's a big part of the learning, is us figuring out how to create these scaffolds. So just naming that we're moving into that space really eyes wide open now. How do we figure out where the scaffolds weren't that we needed, that created conflict and confusion? And then how do we create those conflicts while we navigate those, or how do we create those scaffolds as we navigate those conflicts to have learning occur? Like, oh my God, this is going to be tough, but we have to do that. We have to do that. So I'm noticing we're an hour and a half, and I just want to ask, how do we feel? Are there any other questions or comments anyone would like to offer before we come to a close today? Or is this a good place to just sort of let it soak? I'm curious. Does anyone want to share something?
Oh, I wanted to mention the Midi had the moringa question about invasiveness. And as I was walking at sunset last night through one of the alleys, it's not even a road, it's a pathway. It's a footpath. One of the houses had a whole row of moringa trees, and they were tall enough that they were coming over the wall. So I'm like, just right in my mouth. But moringa it's interesting because it's like a survival food where if everything else collapses, at least you have moringa. And what they did after the Haitian earthquakes was they sent out basically moringa seeds as that emergency food source. So moringa grows in a lot of different places. It does die off in the winter. So anything that doesn't have a freeze, moringa will persist. The issue is it's so prolific, so that after every year you're going to have to trim it back, and eventually it gets so big that you have to pull it out. So it's almost like it's a buffer, and it is a highly nutritious plant that every part of the tree can be used, including the seeds that can be crushed up and used as water filters that take out heavy metals. So I think it's less about invasiveness because it's being grown all around the world, and it's more about what is the need and what is the relationship to the tree. I'm not a moringa man. I don't call myself a moringa man. A lot of my friends are moringa men, and and it's just they're a very funny breed of guys and women, and it's the same thing in Florida. The USDA is there was issues around, is moringa invasive, and then it got declassified as invasive. But I think just wanted to answer that question directly, how we can view plants as invasive where they're just, you could say, well, humans have been traveling all over the planet. Are we invasive? Am I an invasive person? And I'm not in the place that I was born. So I think that's just an interesting question to bring up. And I do promote everybody include moringa in their diet as a huge nutritional superfood.
Yeah, thanks for that, Antonio. And I think it also opens up a really important thing, which is even the concept of invasive has become problematic simply because there's so much rapid environmental change. And that the idea of stable ecosystems in such times of rapid change is exactly the kind of problem that climate change creates. Is everywhere on Earth you lose the stability of climate systems, of regional climate systems. And the idea of native and invasive just becomes messy. You still need to think through it. You still need to understand it. So it's not that it goes away. It's just that there's not the fine lines dividing those categories become more blurry. And so part of this is learning how to adapt our own abilities to handle those uncertainties and complexities as we go about this work, while realizing we're going to make mistakes. So just getting good at adaptively responding to the things we ourselves did wrong. Like, oh, we planted this tree that's now sort of invasive. Well, now we have to go and organize a bunch of work parties and get rid of it, or whatever it may be. That adaptiveness is going to be part of the process. Now, we might do better to avoid certain things than others, like bringing certain kinds of frogs from Costa Rica to Australia that happened once upon a time and created a cascade of biodiversity loss. There are things that we could say, don't do that again. That was a bad idea. Whereas, as Antonio showed with Moringa may be classified as an invasive in the place you are, and you may still choose to bring it in, simply because it has some survival function that's really important as a buffer. And notice that I'm not advocating for it or against it. It was actually already here, and I took it from the wall Antonio was talking about is the wall to the cemetery. I happen to know that because it's the only place Moringa is in town. But the Moringa was already here, and I'm like, oh, let's see if we can grow some and manage it in our fruit forest. I'm curious. The ants eat the leaves so fast they keep killing it. And so it's just really interesting to hold the paradox with whatever choices we make and acknowledge how much we don't know. And then experiment, but try to be responsible experimenters and hold the responsibility that things may happen later that we have to manage because we were partly responsible for them. And that ability to stay in the process for the long term is about being a person of place. So if I'm going to plant moringa trees, I need to be there managing that forest for the next 20 or 30 years, or pass it on to someone else if I pass away. So that continuity of mindfulness over longer periods of time becomes a really important factor that just rises in practical prevalence. So I just want to name that too. And the other thing I want to say is you will start to see a dynamism around this regenerative finance event simply because of what social media does. Simply that, like when Antonio and I post a couple of tweets and then 30 different potential allies appear in the span of an hour, because the context was already sort of pre-laid that we all sort of watched each other and kind of liked each other, and there's a context where we could all converge. The one thing that's going to happen is some changes will occur very quickly. Like we may actually, like yesterday, I had Gregory Landaway send me a message on WhatsApp and just say, hey, Joe, I've got this great artist who's going to create an NFT and he's going to fund projects. Send me a couple of sketches of what you're doing. He's going to create funding for you and we're going to create a DAO. And I'm like, they're just going to create funding for me. Okay. Well, what might happen is someone might create a DAO. I don't even know they do it. And $1 million arrives tomorrow in some cryptocurrency, just because of how quickly these things move. Now, also that may turn into nothing and we get nothing out of it and nothing happens. And that may happen as well. But the thing is that we have to be so agile at just recognizing how quickly changes can just hit us like a big wave. That even if I didn't do it, this is Gregory doing it. Like Gregory may bring me all these capacities or somewhere else that I don't even know about yet. And so this ability to recognize that it's so nonlinear right now, so nonlinear that we just cannot know. And that's why I do so much moment-to-moment improvisation. Which,
I wanted to mention something interesting. I heard over conversation last night with a Colombian guy who was touring the region on his motorcycle, and I was telling him about the ReFi event in October, and he's like, "Oh yeah, no, there's a big like feria, like feria.
Fair.
It's So I looked online, and I think the last one was like 2019, right before COVID. So we want to double check that we're not hosting. I think we'll be the week before the big fair. But once again, going back to who knows how many people will be packed in the Barichara Plaza for this yearly fair come October. So it was good just by getting out and having more conversations with local people. All this information comes up to help better inform how we integrate our outside event into the local community. So I need to, we need to get some more information on if that's happening this year and at what date. So just something to be mindful of.
Yeah, we're going to stumble upon all kinds of information. And I also just want to encourage each of you to, as you're holding this and feeling it into yourself, just ask yourself how it affects the way you make your daily decisions. You know, like how does the way that we are navigating all of this change impact the way you make your own personal choices? Just to invite you to reflect on that. Like I know, Irvi, you've given a lot of attention this year to your health. So how does this affect the way that you think about your own personal health? You know, whatever it is that your struggle is in your own life, how does this relate? Because part of the reason for sharing everything is for us to learn and apply this in our own lives everywhere. And part of it is to make Barichara successful. And so just wanted to name that as this is so complex. And you can just imagine, as much as I know about it now, think about much more it's going to be in 5 years. It's like, we're not stopping, we're moving forward because we have to figure out how to hold the complexity. And so, so this is like a practice, these sort of fire hose conversations of so much going on and not knowing how to hold it all together, becoming disoriented by it, being stressed or overwhelmed. It's like, that's completely understandable and to be expected. Humans have never had to manage this much complexity before. And this is something that I've said in, it's been a few years since I talked a lot about it. The future indigenous will be different from the past because the past indigenous did not have to be planetary. But during this transition, we have to be planetary to be bioregional. Indigenous cultures before were bioregional by being bioregional. But we're trying to survive planetary collapse. So to be bioregional, we have to be planetary as well. And that has not been required before. So the levels of complexity we're dealing with are unprecedented. Even though indigenous cultures are very complex. It's just that what we're dealing with is so unique in the history of the planet. And so learning how to do this is like an upscaling or an upleveling of humanity in a way. And unlike transhumanism that presumes we can just upload to a computer, this is the other way. We have to inload into our bodies and our social spheres and our land-based relationships. And all the complexity has to be held in those places. So just naming how different this is, while a lot of it is familiar to indigenous culture, there are some things about it that are really different. Indigenous people did not have to deal with blockchain and crowdfunding, with the onslaught of globalized market economies. Well, actually, they did. Just a lot of them were wiped out by it.
They had to deal with human sacrifice to the rain god.
And so just to say how important it is to safeguard those indigenous cultures as we're doing this, and to recognize that what we're doing is also new. So just to be humble in that, to really be humble in that. So yeah, thank you everyone. We've gone for long enough. Probably a good time to stop. And I'll end the recording now.